In the autumn of 1845, a farmer in County Cork walked out to his potato field in the morning and found it had turned black overnight. Not one row, not one corner, the entire field. The smell hit him before he reached the first plant, a thick, wet rot, like something had died underground. He knelt down and pulled up a potato with his hands. It dissolved between his fingers. He stood up and looked across his neighbor's fields. They were black too, every one of them. He had 8 children. He had no other crop. He had no savings. He had nothing else. Within 3 years, 1 million people in Ireland would be dead. Within 10 years, another 2 million would be gone, scattered across the ocean to places most of them had never heard of and would never fully understand. This is not a story about policy or politics. This is a story about what it feels like when the ground stops feeding you and nobody comes. To understand what happened in Ireland, you have to understand one thing first. The potato was not just a food. It was the entire foundation of life for roughly 3 million people, the poorest third of the country's population. A single acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for a full year. Nothing else could do that. Not wheat, not oats, not anything else that grew in Irish soil. The potato was dense, nutritious, reliable, and it grew in the kind of thin, rocky ground that would not support any other crop. For the Irish poor, the potato was not a choice. It was the only option that kept them alive. And for a long time, it worked. Ireland's population had grown dramatically over the preceding century, precisely because the potato was so reliable. A man with 1 acre and a potato crop could survive, could marry, could raise children who would survive in turn. The country was densely packed, deeply poor, and almost entirely dependent on a single plant. It was a system with no margin for error. In the late summer of 1845, a disease arrived in Ireland that nobody had seen before. It came without warning, without any way to predict which field would be struck next, or why. A farmer would inspect his crop in the morning and find it healthy. He would return in the evening and find it rotting. The disease worked underground as well as above. A potato that looked perfectly sound on the outside could be entirely black and liquid within. Families dug up their entire stores only to find them collapsing in their hands. The smell of a diseased field in autumn 1845 was reported by witnesses for miles. It was the smell of a country beginning to die. The first year was bad. Perhaps 1/3 of the total potato crop failed across Ireland. People were hungry. People sold what they had, borrowed what they could, ate whatever else was available. Some killed their livestock, their only other asset, to survive the winter. Landlords in some areas reduced rents. Charitable organizations sent food. The government in London authorized limited relief works, paying men to build roads and break stones in exchange for wages barely sufficient to buy a meal. It was not enough, but people told themselves it was 1 year, 1 bad season. The blight would not return. It returned. In 1846, the failure was almost total. Across the entire country, nearly the whole potato crop was gone. Not reduced, not damaged, gone. Farmers who had planted their remaining seed stock in desperate hope watched it rot in the ground before it could be harvested. The relief works that had been barely adequate the previous year were now grotesquely insufficient against a catastrophe of this scale. Men who had walked miles to break stones for starvation wages were now too weak to walk. They died on the roads. They died in the fields. They died in their beds after sending their families out to look for food that was not there. A priest traveling through County Mayo in the winter of 1846 wrote in a letter that he had entered a cabin to administer last rites and found the family inside, still alive, but unable to speak or move. The mother was sitting upright against the wall with a child in her arms. Both were breathing. Neither could respond to him. The father was on the floor. 2 other children were in a corner. He did what he could. He moved on to the next cabin. The next cabin was the same. And the next. He wrote that by the end of that day he had lost count. What happened next is one of the most debated and painful questions in modern history. Food was still leaving Ireland. Through the worst years of the famine, while people were dying of starvation in every county, ships were sailing out of Irish ports loaded with grain, cattle, butter, and pork, bound for England. The food existed. Ireland was producing it. But it was being grown on land owned by landlords who needed their rents paid, and it was being sold to markets that could pay for it. The starving could not pay for it. So it left. The relief works were redesigned and expanded in early 1847, then abruptly cut off by summer of that year, when the government decided that private charity and market forces should take over the burden of feeding the dying. Soup kitchens had been established, at their peak feeding over 3 million people a day, and then they were closed. The logic offered was economic. The reality experienced was death. By the winter of 1847, the character of the famine had changed. The first year had been shock. The second had been desperate endurance. By the third year, what remained was something quieter and more terrible. Communities that had survived for generations simply stopped functioning. The social structures that held rural Irish life together, the networks of labor exchange, the informal credit between neighbors, the collective memory of how to endure hardship, these things require people to maintain them. When enough people are gone, the structures collapse too. Evictions accelerated the destruction. Landlords who had tolerated unpaid rents through the first year of the famine now moved to clear their estates. A family that could not pay was put out. Their cabin was often demolished immediately behind them to prevent return. A woman named Bridget Reardon, not a famous woman, not a woman whose name appears in any history book, was evicted from her cabin in County Clare in the spring of 1848 with 4 children, her husband having died the previous winter. She was given no notice. A bailiff arrived with men who pulled the roof down while she was still inside. She walked to the nearest town with the children and sat down in the road outside the workhouse gate. The workhouse was full. They did not let her in. What happened to her after that is not recorded. She simply disappears from the documents. That disappearance, from the records, from history, from memory, is one of the defining features of the famine. The people who suffered most were the people who left the fewest traces. They did not write memoirs. They did not appear in newspapers except as numbers. They died in places where nobody was counting carefully, and even the numbers that were recorded are almost certainly far lower than the reality. 1 million dead. That is the figure most commonly given, but it is an estimate, and most historians believe it is a conservative one. Death came from starvation directly, but more often from the diseases that hunger made possible. Typhus, dysentery, relapsing fever, conditions that a healthy body might survive, but a starving one could not. Entire townlands were wiped out, not because every person died, but because the combination of death and emigration left so few behind that the community could not sustain itself. Villages that had held 200 families in 1844 held 20 by 1852, and those 20 were the ones who had found some way, any way, to get out. The emigration was its own catastrophe, layered on top of the first one. Ships carrying emigrants were not built for passengers. They were cargo vessels, hastily converted by owners who saw profit in the desperate traffic of the starving. The cheapest fares went on vessels that should not have been carrying human beings at all. Old, poorly maintained ships with inadequate ventilation, no sanitation, insufficient food and water for voyages that could last 6 weeks or more. The mortality on these crossings was high enough that they acquired a name. People called them coffin ships, and the name was earned. Men, women, and children who had survived the famine in Ireland and had found the passage money somehow and had made it to the dock and had boarded the ship, they died in the hold before they reached the other side. They were buried at sea without ceremony, without record, without anyone to tell their families where they had gone. Those who survived the crossing arrived in Canada and the United States in conditions that made them unwelcome everywhere. They were visibly sick, visibly starving, visibly desperate. The reception in many ports was hostile. They were processed through quarantine stations where the weak were separated from those considered healthy enough to enter. Families were divided. People who had traveled together were suddenly separated by officials who spoke a language they barely understood, making decisions about their lives with complete indifference to their preferences. And yet, they stayed. They built. In the decades that followed, the Irish who survived, both those who remained in Ireland and those who scattered across the English-speaking world, built something out of what was left. Not quickly, not without enormous cost. The psychological damage of what had happened to that generation was carried forward in ways that are still being untangled by their descendants. A deep distrust of authority, a relationship with hunger that went beyond the physical, a tendency toward silence about suffering that was mistaken by outsiders for stoicism, but was actually closer to a wound that had never been allowed to heal. Ireland's population in 1845 was approximately 8 million people. By 1855, it was below 6 million. By 1900, it was below 4.5 million. The country had been halved, not only by death, but by the leaving that death made necessary, and by the leaving that the memory of death continued to make necessary for generations afterward. That trajectory, that long demographic collapse beginning in a single autumn when the potatoes turned black, has no real parallel in the modern history of any country in the Western world. The farmer in County Cork who walked out to his field that morning in 1845 and found it rotting, he did not know he was standing at the beginning of a catastrophe. He knew only that the smell was wrong, and that his children were inside the cabin, and that the thing he had counted on was gone. He pulled up another plant. It fell apart. He stood up. He looked at his neighbor's field. He already knew what he would see. That moment, one man, one field, one morning, is where it starts. Everything else follows from it, across a decade of suffering so vast and so uneven that it defies any single narrative. But that is where it starts, and it is worth standing there for a moment before moving on. Worth feeling the weight of what that man was about to face, and what was coming for everyone he knew, before the history begins to speak in the aggregate numbers that are easier to hold than the individual faces. One field, one morning, one smell of rot carried on the autumn air. And then everything changed.